player through the... Great, excellent. Wunderbar. All right. Superb. Sounds good. Pardon? Perfect. All right. That's great. Okay, thank you so much. Mhm. All right. Ready to go? All right. Good afternoon. Sorry. Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. I'm Emily Wilkins, a congressional correspondent for CNBC and the current president of the National Press Club. Thank you guys so much for joining us, both those of us here in the room today, as well as those of us who are joining online, for our headliner event with Dr. Robert Califf, the Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. We are happy to accept your questions, and I'll ask as many as time permits. To submit a question online, please email headliners@press.org and put FDA in the subject line. For our C-SPAN and public radio audiences, please be aware that in the audience today are members of the general public, so any applause or reaction you hear is not necessarily from the working press. And it is now my pleasure to introduce the distinguished head table. Please stand when your name is called. Brooke Boozer, the Commissioner's granddaughter and intern at the General Services Administration. We're going to ask that you hold your applause until the end, but I am going to make an exception for Brooke. William Pierce, Senior Director, APCO Worldwide. Firdaus Al-Farouk, the Senior Editor, Regulatory Focus. Donna Laiwan-Leger, the president of DC Media Strategies and a past National Press Club president and co-leader of our amazing headliners team. Michael Felberbaum, the assistant commissioner for media affairs with the FDA. Hunter Ehrman, the director of policy communications, National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Leah Hunter, the associate commissioner for external affairs with the FDA, and Jed Judson, the land warfare reporter with Defense News and the past NPC president. And if you feel like applauding, now is a great time to do so. The Center for Disease Control recently reported that vaccination rates for common childhood illnesses among school-aged children remain at 93%, a decline from the pre-pandemic rate of 95%. When exemption rates reach greater than 5%, the risk of outbreaks of vaccine-preventable illnesses increases. Vaccine hesitancy appears to be indicative of a larger sentiment, a declining trust in science and scientists. A recent survey from Pew found that 27% of Americans say they have not too much or no confidence in scientists to act in the public interest. Now, that is up from 12% in 2020, but 27% is still not a whole lot. In practical terms, that distrust is leading to challenges to science-based institutions. Next month, the Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in a case over an abortion drug that could undermine the authority of the FDA to regulate drugs. A lower court ruling questioned the FDA's decision-making process, calling it arbitrary and capricious. Dr. Robert Califf, who is serving for a second time as commissioner of the FDA, says he's in a constant battle with misinformation that sows distrust. Distortions and half-truths about medicine and science are a leading cause of death in America, he told the Associated Press. Today, we are eager to hear more about how the FDA is responding to these challenges. Please join me in a warm National Press Club welcome to FDA Commissioner Dr. Robert Califf.
Thanks for the provocative introduction. That was great. And part of what I want to do today is not tell you so much about what the FDA is doing, although I look forward to the Q&A. I want to challenge you about what you're doing as part of this, and perhaps we can have a good discussion about it. I mean, in a sense, since it's Valentine's Day, I'm sporting my Valentine's bow tie. you know, it's time to maybe give a little tough love to you guys as part of that in your position in the Fourth Estate. But I'm also the grandson of a Baptist minister, so I want to start out by acknowledging that we're all sinners. I mean, we all have a role in the statistics and the situation that you just gave. I'll also point out I've always been an avid consumer of the news. I believe in the importance of the free press, as well as the power that the press has and the responsibility to society that comes with it. I'll have to admit I'm a recovering former reporter. I was a beat reporter for the Duke Chronicle during my freshman year at sort of the peak of the Vietnam War. It was quite an interesting time. So I think the free press is an essential element of a strong America, and the First Amendment is first for a reason. Some have called journalism the first rough draft of history, and while this role as chronicler remains true, we all know the changes in technology and across society mean that journalism is at a very different place and is a very different creature since this description was first coined. The growing number of traditional and social media outlets provide more opportunities to share information, spark meaningful conversation, invite calls to action, as well as to provide vast amounts of information about diverse peoples, their communities, their thoughts, and their needs. I was noticing Brooke was alternating, I think, between TikTok and Instagram on the metro on the way here. And this ocean of information is augmented and shaped by so many new and non-traditional venues for exchange of information and opinions. I was drawn to a 2023 report from Stanford on science education that said, quote, an overwhelming body of evidence suggests that students are not so much digital natives as digital novices. They may be in a digital sea, but they are rudderless, lacking the basic navigational tools that would ensure they are not deceived, unquote. If this is true of high school and university students, what about the general public? Indeed, the vast amount of information, information environment that offers so much opportunity to enrich our society also has the potential to cause enormous harm. What you publish, the words you use, and who you quote to provide context and authority has tremendous implications for every issue you discuss, perhaps nowhere more than the area in which I spent most of my waking hours, public health, and the choices of individual people, health professionals, patients, and consumers in their health behavior. As I've grappled with the impact of communications and miscommunications on health, particularly what the FDA and others can do in this space, there are several aspects specifically related to the media that I feel are especially important to discuss. We're currently in the midst of a significant decline in life expectancy in this country, and our health outcomes and life expectancy lag almost all other high-income countries. The proximal causes are not mysterious. COVID and other respiratory viruses, suicide and overdose, gun violence, and underlying it all is a base of an increasing toll of chronic non-communicable disease. We also have a very high level of fetal and maternal mortality compared with other high-income countries and even middle-income countries now. The way information is conveyed to consumers and patients through the media and other sources about this issue and the factors that are causing it and what individuals and society can do to reverse it directly impacts the health of our nation. A recent series of articles in the Washington Post painted a vivid picture of this impact, documenting the direct link between the communication of bad information, bad decisions at the individual and policy level, bad health, and higher rates of death. Some of you have likely heard me talk about this before. Indeed, throughout my career, I've been fascinated and concerned about the ways we use information to make decisions. In 3 decades of work as a busy clinician and researcher in the fields of clinical trials and health outcomes and quality, it was striking to observe the difference when expert clinicians were armed with high-quality evidence about the best practices and interventions. But these days, even high-quality evidence can be distorted and misrepresented in ways that I could not have imagined in the past. I'm sure you all agree that the internet and digitization of our world has dramatically changed the way we learn, communicate, and share information with profound consequences for health. Given that the way information is presented in this new and rapidly changing environment and does directly affect the decisions people make for themselves and their families about their health, the critical question is how each of us, as individuals and professions, should adapt our approaches to meet the moment. The influence of information presentation and the way people digest it on what medications people take, what foods they eat or don't eat, whether they choose to smoke or vape, and whether people get vaccinated or which vaccines they get and when, all these decisions truly have life and death consequences. COVID vaccination, unfortunately, as you nicely pointed out, remains the most salient and easy to speak about example. With over 1 billion doses of these life-saving vaccines administered, the scientific evidence presented in countless studies has demonstrated the safety of these vaccines as a dramatic reduction in the risk of death, hospitalization, and serious illness afforded by them. Just in the past month, Europe and the UK have published the evidence that since the start of the pandemic, enormous numbers of lives have been saved and hospitalizations prevented. These findings complement the Commonwealth Fund's definitive work on the huge beneficial effect of the COVID vaccines in the United States. And just last week, a major report from Sweden and Norway showed that babies born from mothers with updated vaccination had lower rates of death and other adverse events in infancy. Yet the ongoing proliferation of misinformation and disinformation about these facts and the failure to provide adequate and continued attention to the clear risk reduction provided by these vaccines has resulted in a distorted view in the population about COVID vaccination, and this incorrect perception has led to lower vaccine uptake. This is now spilling over, as you also pointed out, into the general vaccination issue as evidenced by the recent reemergence of measles. Who would have thought that measles would be back with us? What this unfortunate trend means is continued death and serious illness as a toll of COVID-19, much of which could have been prevented through the use of readily available, safe, and effective vaccines and therapies. Let me just offer you a recent example of a situation where the focus on the sensational took precedence on this topic. Several weeks ago, media outlets from around the world reported on the Florida Surgeon General's unfounded call to halt the COVID vaccines. It was a splashy news story, easy to report and filled with conflict, albeit unmerited. In fact, only a few weeks earlier, the FDA publicly shared a letter we sent to the Florida Surgeon General on the precise underlying issue he raised. We outlined the implausibility of it and reinforced the thorough scientific assessments that give the FDA confidence in the quality, safety, and effectiveness of the vaccines. No drama, just facts. Not surprisingly, only 1 or 2 reporters wrote about it then. Make no mistake, it's important for the public to understand a range of views to help inform their own opinion. But too often, the panoply of stories to which people are exposed causes them to lose sight of the underlying issues that would enable them to live longer free of hospitalization and disability. Instead, they're often given equal or greater print or airtime to a relatively small but persistent group of stories and opinions that have the benefit of generating controversy, even when those reports are based on views that disagree with and do not represent the vast majority of expert opinion. This trend of both-sidism and free balance, it's not a new issue, you know about it. In the example I just noted, the stories were about one outspoken Surgeon General who opposes vaccines. A simple review of the landscape reveals that almost all other Surgeon Generals and state health officials support the widespread use of vaccines. There's another key impact growing out of the way information is conveyed by the media that goes beyond individual health decisions. It can profoundly and inaccurately alter the trust the public has in institutions like the FDA, whose primary mission and mandate are to protect and promote public health, whose work is based on science and data. A single decision made by the FDA can elicit a multitude of reactions, good, bad, and indifferent. And I've often heard people say, and I actually think this is true, that we've done our job, we know we've done it well when everyone is pissed off. We had a new one come up day before yesterday. Someone told me, you'll know you've done your job on this issue when you get sued. And that's now a new metric when we have to take on industries who may have things that could be improved. I bring this up because there's always opportunity to portray decisions made by the agency in a negative light, if that's the approach someone wants to take. And this exists even when there are many more people who've reached positive side of the story. One other issue I want to bring up, which is I think a lot of people know is something that just drives me crazy, is headlines. And I know the people that write the stories don't write the headlines, and you don't necessarily like the way it's done either. But I was really taken by the sort of proof in the pudding when a randomized trial was done of writing negative versus positive headlines and the impact that it had. And so whoever owns your news outlet knows what they're doing, because a negative headline actually elicited a much greater likelihood that the person would go on and read the rest of the article. And so I'm not saying that you can necessarily fix this, but we've got to recognize this as one of many issues that's affecting the way that people think. I learned early on in I had a brief time of studying the press and health reporting, which is another story. But I heard a lot then about the basic rule that 25% of people read the headline and that's it. And then the next 25% only read the first two sentences, and it goes on from there. By the time you get to the end of the article, you got something like 5% of the reading audience. So but how we deal with these things is becoming increasingly important in this era of social media, because the world has changed. There are so many voices and a constant stream of information and opinion. For example, I did a little research. Some social media influencers and podcasters have audiences now in the tens of millions and above, well beyond what any mainstream media has. And so the writing that you're doing is competing with a constant, incessant onslaught from people with very large audiences who are greatly reinforced. And of course, expertise in biomedical science and fact-checking are not required to be an influencer on social media. So over the past few years, we've redoubled our efforts at the FDA, and I won't go through all the ways, but basically trying to help you do fact-checking, creating resources on our website, posting more videos, live streaming media and stakeholder calls, increasing interviews with our subject matter experts. I probably don't need to tell you that FDA attracts introverts to work at the FDA, so I would ask a little sympathy as we work with our subject matter experts and their media presence. And then, of course, working with our stakeholders. And I've got a talented small staff by budget who are represented here today, who I think are doing a great job. So I'll close with just a couple of quick comments. We have to recognize that the FDA, as powerful as the government may be, in this new world of the onslaught of social media, we're like a tiny speck in a universe of information. And despite all of our efforts and the efforts of others, health misinformation is pervasive, and health literacy remains a barrier to access, causing significant harm and delaying prevention of treatment for real people. While we're going to continue to work at this as much as we can, all parties in the ecosystem, from regulated industry, academic institutions to medical associations, and local healthcare providers need to take an active role. The clinical and biomedical expert community has a particularly important role to play as trusted intermediaries to convey reliable information to patients and consumers. I feel that this group is also overwhelmed with information. The proliferation of journals and internet sources makes it more and more difficult for busy professionals to keep up. But the polls continue to reinforce that people trust their local clinicians, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and others. So we're redoubling our efforts to communicate effectively with this group. I do want to point out that I feel like in a way we lost sight of this because there was good reason to focus on communicating with the public, which requires a form of straightforward communication that sometimes doesn't take into account the complexity that a healthcare professional might want in order to understand why a decision has been reached by a regulatory agency. So we're doubling down on this. So finally, given the primary priority of preserving freedom of the press and freedom of speech, and these enormous changes in the environment that I've referred to in which we all operate, I want to challenge you as journalists, just as we're challenging ourselves at the FDA. As I said, we are all sinners, including the FDA. We need to continue striving for approaches that benefit public health in the best possible manner. So with that, I'll look forward to your questions and hopefully a good interchange here.
Thank you so much. Do you want to sit down? It's more comfortable.
That'd be great.
I mean, if you want to stand, you can.
No.
It's apparently healthier for you, although you would be the expert on that, not me. So I actually kind of just wanted to start, because we have so many topics to cover, with kind of something at the 30,000-foot level, which is just a bit about the healthcare debate in our country in general. And I'm wondering if you see healthcare, should it be treated more as a fundamental right, or should it be treated as a privilege? And how does that outlook impact your work and how you approach things at the FDA?
Yeah, I have to say here, I'm expressing my personal opinion, not an opinion of the FDA, because if you, just to reinforce that, I mean, the FDA has statutory regulations that tell us what the job of the FDA is, and it's not the payment for healthcare, for example, or the whole healthcare system. But it's well known. I think healthcare is a right, or should be a right. And I think we're proving in this country, we're busy proving that not treating it that way has tremendous adverse consequences. There's a reason that our life expectancy is now more than 5 years shorter than other high-income countries, and we're rapidly diverging in the wrong direction, while other countries which provide universal health care are doing better. And I would add, again, this is my personal opinion, but I have a track record on this. We're now up to $4.5 trillion being spent, a lot of it on very expensive technical health care, where countries that focus on simple things like, is your blood pressure under control? Are you using tobacco? If you're pregnant, do you get access to first-rate care immediately and throughout your pregnancy? Those countries are doing better than we are. So the answer is not a bunch more high-tech stuff. With that, I have to say, though, from the FDA perspective, of course, one of our jobs is helping industry develop effective technologies. Everywhere I go in the world, people are envious of our creativity in inventing new things in the United States. But your question really brought to the issue of what do we do once we've gotten things on the market? Mm-hmm. And we're working closely with NIH right now to try to do something about the evidence system in the post-market.
Can you speak a little bit more about that?
It's the concept is fairly simple and shouldn't be a surprise, but it was instructive to me because I spent a lot of my career doing very large clinical trials of common treatments to figure out what's best. And I was always bothered by the FDA because it had all these requirements for doing things that didn't seem important in the kind of clinical trials I was doing. And what I've come to realize is that's because 95% of what the FDA does, its major mandate is in the pre-approval phase, where 90% of people's best ideas fail. And we have a system that's very detailed to make sure that we catch things that aren't going to work and keep them from getting on the market. That's a service to the world because things that do get on the market, get on the market first in the U.S. But it's almost as if, and it goes back to a 1962 law, as you know, that happened after thalidomide that gave the FDA this power. So we regulate that pre-market phase. But once things are on the market, and I was a busy clinician, I feel like I can speak with this with authority. There seems to be some view that doctors just magically know what to do. But a drug or a device getting approved for a particular indication in a particular population doesn't tell you what to do compared to other options that may be available, or how to combine them. And so we've left that space vacant. The NIH is our National Institute of Health, has a new director, Dr. Bertinoli, who I've become very good friends with. She's a cancer surgeon. And she's very driven to work together to create something in this space that we're going to spend $4.5 trillion. Let's do a lot of the stuff that works, and let's don't do things that don't work. It's kind of a simple way to think about it.
I know you talked a lot during your speech about misinformation, and I think it's very interesting to hear your perspectives on this. And you're right, no, I don't write the headlines. Thank you for acknowledging that. But I'm wondering, what can the medical product industry do to fight misinformation? And is there anything that the FDA can do to kind of encourage the private sector in this effort?
So when you say private sector, I would really like to expand it to the whole regulated
Go for it.
space, because we regulate 20% of the economy, and even things like airlines. There's food on airlines. So I think the whole responsible business community needs to pay more attention to this, because it affects their employees and the families of the people that work for them. When you see people, it's not just, people tend to think, well, life expectancy in the U.S. is short. That means old people are dying off earlier. But it's really all the way from maternal and fetal mortality. We have an enormous difference now in the working age of mortality and chronic disease, people who have debilitating illnesses that make them less functional. So there are coalitions forming, I'm pleased to say. It's very important to point out that and we have court decisions weighing on some of this, we can't tell the private sector what to do, so I don't want this to be interpreted in any way as we have any control over this. But I do think coalitions of private sector need to gather up reliable information and make sure the people that work for them in their communities are getting the good information. We had some stories before in the reception before about the news deserts, and I think that's an important part of this. I think the news industry and the people that are controlling the money in the news industry, which I know is not you guys, have got to pay attention to having local reporters, because people are going to trust people they know more. So, yeah, I mean, the one thing I can tell you that will not work is for the medical products industry to proclaim that they have the truth. It's sort of like federal agencies. We have limits. There are a lot of people that mistrust the government, which is why I'm stressing this is not any individual sectors, but just because no one of us owns it doesn't mean that none of us are accountable. We all have to be accountable.
Sure, everyone's got a little bit of a piece of the pie and their own role to play with it. I want to head in a bit of a different direction and ask you what the FDA is doing to better understand some of the chronic diseases, things like diabetes and hypertension. I know these impact many Americans. Talk a little bit about what the FDA is doing when they look into those.
Well, as you might imagine, this has been a focus of mine, and it's a timely question, but I'm not sure who asked it, but maybe someone knew. We have a thought piece that just came out in the New England Journal on chronic disease in America and what needs to be done about it. Since we don't make the products and we don't do the primary research, that's the NIH's job in our federal portfolio. Our job is mostly to work with the industries to develop products that will be effective for these diseases. And they're complicated, they're big, and so a big part of what we got to do is to make it efficient to study large numbers of people for these big diseases, and that's been a problem. You may have noticed that the pharmaceutical industry, for example, increasingly is developing niche drugs that might be highly effective for smaller populations. And I don't want to discount that. It's very important. This is going to be an amazing time, for example, for rare genetic diseases that kill children who previously had no other treatment. It's going to be great. But we also, because of the way things are going, we got to develop better treatments. And a good example is what's happened with the GLP-1 agonist, which not only cause weight loss, but also now we know reduce cardiovascular events. And we're currently looking at that data for whether FDA should give approval for that indication. So we'll have to see what the data show, but at least the published studies now look really good. But areas like chronic lung disease, fourth leading cause of death in the world, and You know, we need new treatments that are effective. But I want to come back to our work with NIH and other federal agencies. We got a lot of stuff that works now that's not being used effectively in this country, and it's almost as if the simpler and more ubiquitous the treatment availability is, the worse job we do. We tend to focus on the high-tech stuff. We need to control blood pressure, control lipids, these very straightforward things we're not doing well right now.
Is there a sense of why that is? Is it just that, you know, the big tech stuff is shinier and more fun to talk about?
I think, so this gets out of FDA's lane again, but I don't know, you tried to get a primary care appointment in the United States lately? I think it's basically, the good part of it is we love new things in technology in the US and we're very individualistic. And that means that we're innovating and creating new things the rest of the world gets to use. But we've got to get back to the basics and have, you ask the question, is it a right? Well, if it was a right, you'd be able to make a primary care appointment easily. And you wouldn't have copays that put you out of the ability, if you're a low-income person, from getting the basic care that you need.
Sure. And I know at the same point, I know you were talking just about the basics, but I know that there's been this Operation Warp Speed for rare diseases. Where does that stand? What is the plan for funding that?
Well, I don't actually use the name Warp Speed to describe it. I know others do, but I would just say, let's look at where we are now. And the biology, the biomedical science, it's done its job. I mean, if you would have told me 10 years ago that we could identify the exact gene causing a disease in a child and go in and snip out that gene and put in a new one, I just would have said that's science fiction. We now have multiple cases where this is happening. You know, sickle cell is one of the first, not such a rare disease, but a very important one that just got approval. But if you look at the journals now, you see a number of studies with these technologies that look great. So now we have to develop a regulatory system that can handle a situation where the reason people of the world have been protected from treatments that don't work is that we do clinical trials that tell you whether it works or not. To do a good clinical trial, you have to have an adequate sample size. We have some diseases with like 30 people in the world have this disease. There's no way to use the same evidence generation system. So there's already progress being made here, but we got to invent that system. But I'd add to it, if you look at people with rare diseases, they're not all born in large academic medical centers. They're all over the world. Yeah. But the expertise to care for someone with a serious rare disease is got to be in a hyper-specialized environment. So we've got to create the networks that not only identify these people, but get them to where adequate care can be given. We don't have an economic model, for example, to fund the R&D. I've been on that side of it too. If you try to raise money now for a treatment for people with 30 people with a disease, it's not an attractive traditional model of putting in venture capital and then getting a big return.
Sure.
And then you ask the question, we got 10,000 rare diseases. If we could treat 2,000 of them tomorrow, if the going rate of $1 million to $2 million a treatment is what it is, how are we going to pay for that, for the delivery side of it? So these are all questions. The good news is in our user-fee agreements, we got money to hire a lot of people. We're doing that. Peter Marks is a great leader. Patrizia Cavazzoni and Cedar is also a great leader, and we're, stay tuned, we're working on systems. But you know the basic ingredients. It's getting really smart people to work together, interdigitate a lot with the outside world for the best ideas. Then you have to make changes in the regulatory system, which frightens everyone because you're not sure how it's going to work until you try it. A lot of people have said it worked in cancer, and it really did. We made a number of changes, and look what's happening. We're seeing a pretty significant reduction in cancer mortality with a number of treatments. So I think we can do the same thing here. It's just going to take some work.
I wanted to also ask you about the FDA being sued in court for allowing the abortion drug mifepristone on the market. Some, of course, including HHS Secretary Becerra, who was right here at the club last week, have said that the lawsuit doesn't only endanger access to the abortion drug, but FDA's regulatory authority more broadly. What are your thoughts on the lawsuit? How do you think this is going to be playing out?
Well, one day I look forward to giving all my thoughts on the lawsuit, but it's a case in action, so I'm very restricted in what I can say beyond, what I've already said multiple times. I think the beauty of the American system, which is the envy of the world, is that we have a strong FDA with about, I don't know, a handful of us, maybe 5 or 6, who are political appointees. All the rest are full-time civil servants with no financial conflict of interest, under heavy scrutiny, who have no mission other than the public health of the U.S. and who have expertise in weighing the risks and benefits based on the evidence. They did that for mifepristone. The answer's been consistent at the FDA. It's not changing. We stand behind the science. And I've also already publicly expressed worry about eroding that, and I know people who depend on on knowing that the medicines they're taking are safe and effective have expressed worry that undermining that civil service weighing of risk and benefit based on evidence could really have bad consequences for the future.
I know that the FDA has also, going from the one branch of government to another, has asked Congress to create a new pathway for in vitro diagnostics products under the VALID Act. Now, that did fail to pass the last time it was in Congress, but now the agency says they're planning to issue a rule regulating laboratory-developed tests. How involved have you been with that rulemaking process, and when can we expect it to be finalized?
A lot involved. A lot of my early academic career was in something you wouldn't normally think of as a test, but it was in coronary angiography and exercise stress testing and cardiology. But it's the same principle. You do a test, and it's only useful if the operating characteristics of the test, that is, does it give you a correct diagnosis or prognosis? And we know how to quantify that. And all we're really trying to do is to get to a situation where if you go to any hospital or medical practice in the U.S. and your doctor or nurse practitioner says, we're going to do this test, that those who make and sell the test can provide evidence that what they're saying about the test is true and that it's presented to the clinical community in an accurate fashion. So I've been very involved in the rulemaking. I'm completely behind it. I wish Congress had, I don't know how to say it, done its job, whatever. That would be the best, because we would do better with a pathway that had the things in it. Rulemaking, as I'm sure you know, is limited in what we can do, but it's a start. And I think it's a very important start. I've recently had family members with serious cancer, and it just really disturbs me that you could go to different cancer centers and get entirely different answers based on which version of the test they happen to use.
Absolutely. I also wanted to ask a little bit, because I know the FDA is going through what has been described as the biggest reorganization in its history. It's proposing to revamp the Human Foods Program and its Office of Regulatory Affairs. You've sent the plan up the chain. Can you talk a little bit about what you're hoping to accomplish with this new reorganization, and when do you expect it to be approved, and then, if it is approved, implemented?
Well, I'll start at the last part of your question. I can't say when it's going to be okayed. It has to go through quite a process in the executive branch, and Congress gets to weigh in with comments. And so, since it's under consideration now, I have to stay pretty quiet about that. But I'm very optimistic, because I think it's a great plan. The whole workforce essentially was involved. It affects thousands of people. I knew in 2016, when I was commissioner at that time, that it would be really good to sort of upgrade the way we do inspections with a tremendous workforce, but very limited technology that FDA had at the time. And so what we've done, it started with a Human Foods Program where for whatever reason, we'd end up with a system where you had segments that didn't fit together well in the organization. We fixed that. We have a leader for human foods, Jim Jones, who's tremendous. And the inspectorate now is led by Michael Rogers, who's another great leader. But the basic idea is to really modernize the workflow of the work on that side of the FDA. Remember, on the medical product side, we have user fees, which I've always said that philosophically, I wish the taxpayer would pay for the FDA, not the industry that we're regulating. But there's a discipline exerted by the user fees because we have to justify the way we're spending the money to a group of executives who are paying the bills. And on the other side, we haven't had that. The other part about the user fees is they actually want the work to get done, so they pay what it takes to get the work done. The food side of the FDA has been tremendously under-resourced. I see some Reagan-Udall people over here. The Reagan-Udall report lays all this out. I think it's worth a read. But I think things are going great. You know, we have to get through all the hurdles before we can finalize the reorganization, but we've got thousands of people who are interested in working on it.
You touched on anti-obesity medication, and we have a question from the audience on how is media attention on this anti-obesity medication impacting how the FDA informs patients and its providers, and what issues is the FDA experiencing with this?
I'd say first of all, it's an amazing turn of events. As a cardiologist, if you had talked to me in 2016, I would have said cardiovascular drug development looks dead. I mean, there's nothing happening, and I was pretty upset about it. And then, of course, along comes this whole class and multiple other classes that were essentially developed for diabetes, not for cardiovascular disease, but we all know it's now called cardiometabolic disease because of the way it comes together. Whoever thought we'd have a shortage of a drug class in a setting where those who make it are making a huge amount of money for every dose they manufacture. They just can't keep up with the demand. So one thing we're very worried about, and throughout HHS, is that right now the wealthy and highly educated are basically getting access to this treatment, and people who may need it the most can't get access. That's a concern. But you mentioned that what's being told to the public, and you know, we regulate the advertising done by those who make the drug and sell it, but we don't regulate third parties who start clinics and sell things over the internet. And I've recently been noticing a number of these ads that don't give the whole risk-benefit story, and we don't have authority to really regulate these folks. So it's an interesting component of it. But you know, this is a chance for me to just say, if we look at the American population and this decline in life expectancy, a lot of it does appear related to the fact that as a society, we're essentially gaining a pound a year as a society. It starts in childhood. It leads to diabetes, vascular disease, cancer, all sorts of other things. So we've got to attack this both on the food side of the FDA. It's almost as if we're creating obesity and then we're trying to reverse engineer it with a very expensive drug. That sounds like about the least efficient way you could possibly do it. But having said that, you know, the data looks great on these drugs, and I think the number is now 420 different clinical trials being done around the world. So our knowledge about this is going to grow a lot in the near future.
So you think that the FDA could eventually, give the green light to some of these drugs for weight loss reasons?
We have a saying, in God we trust, all others must bring data. So
But it sounds like there is a good bit of data now.
If the data fabric supports it, people will get an indication. And let's also remember that at least the preliminary anecdotal evidence indicates there may be an effect on addiction behavior. That would be an enormous breakthrough if that was true, and I know studies are ongoing in that regard. So it's fascinating that this circuit of the gut and the brain, if you love biology, this is like an amazing thing that we sort of knew it was there, but we didn't understand it. And it took a drug that probed that circuit in order to begin to understand how it works. And the circuit is affecting other things besides just food addiction. It's probably affecting other types of addiction. Maybe video games.
Scrolling through, if they have like an Instagram scrolling one, like that would be very interested. Well, we've talked about losing weight. I think the other like big thing that everyone wants to see from medicine is life expectancy, quality of life. We have a question that despite declining life expectancy, there is a growing interest in healthy aging and improving quality of life. What role does the FDA envision playing, and how it could evolve to better facilitate drug development aimed at these goals?
I think, the FDA's role specifically there is pretty indirect, right? Because we don't do the research primarily that's needed. And many of the factors are already available globally. Like, I helped start a medical school in Singapore, and I had the privilege of going over there as on an FDA visit to Singapore and India. Singapore's got a big problem. Half of their population of teenagers is expected to live to be age 100. And
it doesn't sound like a problem. It sounds like a
well, so they're very concerned about what to do as people finish their normal life expectancy job situation. And they've started this program called reemployment, where they have a specific government program that after you've retired, you can, as a matter of privilege, go back to work 2 or 3 hours a day doing something that you like to do that's contributing to society. Because we all know that, and there's good data in the US and every other country, that if people retire and they have nothing to do, they die fairly quickly, relatively speaking. So a lot of this, I don't think, has anything to do with new drugs. I think it has to do with having a society that supports a reasonable life, regardless of age, including the elderly. They're building communities in Singapore that are built specifically to support aging. One other thing to mention, because it relates to things I've done in my career that I find fascinating, and I'm 72, so when people talk about the elderly, I'm now in that category. And I used to be an athlete, but now I worry about falling. And if you look at the built environment with sensors and the ability to integrate technology, in places like Scandinavia, they're creating home environments where you can grow old and be secure and not end up, in a nursing home, in an impersonal environment. And I'm really pleased to say that CDRH is actually actively working on, not that they have the answers yet, but if you think about device development like sensors, if you do it one at a time, you'll never put the whole suite together into something that fits together in the environment that you like to have for your best health at home. So they're working on a strategy for how to create regulatory pathways to help make that happen. I spent 5 years at Alphabet between my 2 FDA stints, and almost every day some bright young engineer would come in with some device or sensor that was going to cure this or that. But you could never, if it was just a one-off thing, it would never cut it. It's got to be integrated in some way. But we don't have a regulatory pathway that does that now.
Is it important to develop one, or is that really not something that the FDA should be focusing on?
I think it's important. Is it, though, should a majority of our workforce be focused on this? No, but again, this also relates to other elements. Like, let's say you're traveling on an interstate and you get into a major accident, you end up in a rural hospital that doesn't have a trauma surgeon. There's nothing about technology that would prevent us from having the world's best trauma surgeons scrub in on the case, except we haven't put all the technologies, all the individual technologies exist. They haven't been put together into the right configuration. So these principles, I think, the best regulators are people that see where science is going and where society is going, and they create regulatory pathways that help the industry get there and help the industry not go in the wrong direction.
Well, speaking of where science is going, we do have a question about artificial intelligence. And I just want to see what you think an appropriate role for AI is when it comes to medicine.
I've always advised people to be suspicious of those who get overly enthusiastic about technologies, but I really think after almost decades of being skeptical about AI, it's hit the tipping point now. And I think an easy way for people to think about this, for those of you who are old enough, I'm not sure Brooke even existed in this time. Do you remember when you were going for a trip and you would take out your maps and you put them in your glove compartment? And then you get into arguments with the family as you try to stop and figure out where to go. Now you just talk to your car. That's artificial intelligence. How does, your car knows the patterns that you like. It's integrating information in real time continuously. And let's take maybe people's other favorite experience now. Other than if you go to a concierge doctor, does your doctor look at you when you go to the clinic? And the answer is they try, but they are under the gun to click the right boxes to get the billing done while you're being seen in clinic and to create a note in a clunky system. There is no question that large language models that are going to be just in your standard Microsoft or Gmail applications now will be used to generate clinic notes. So your doctor can actually look at you and talk with you instead of worrying about clicking into a computer. That's already, pilot studies already done, that's going to happen. So you begin to think about how that's going to transform the way we do our work. I'm very enthusiastic about FDA. If you think about what our reviewers spend their time doing, a lot of it is spent trying to square old documents with new documents, and that's going to get radically simplified by the powers of large language models and AI, so our reviewers can spend more time using their brains instead of trying to do clerical work that can be done by a machine. Short answer is, yeah, I'm really enthusiastic about AI now. If you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have said, interesting, but not ready for prime time.
And now I feel like it's definitely become more in the spotlight for sure. I also wanted to ask if you can give us kind of your frank analysis of the accelerated pathway for drugs. What needs to change here, and what did you learn from the experiences with the Alzheimer's drug aducanumab? Wait, aducanumab? I practiced before.
Aducanumab?
That's perfect, thank you.
Well, first of all, on the accelerated pathway, Americans are different than the rest of the world. People want access to things, and it's always intrigued me how people that don't like accelerated pathways tend to blame the FDA. It's a set of laws that actually dictate accelerated pathways passed by your elected officials representing the will of people who have diseases without effective treatments. And there's a question, let's say you had a disease with a shortened life expectancy that was significant, or your child had a lethal disease with no effective treatment. Would you rather wait for the proof to come in, or would you rather get access to the treatment when there was enough evidence that a full-time civil servant, not someone representing the company, thought it was reasonably likely that the evidence supported that the treatment would be effective? And I think people with those problems have spoken loudly. Now, aducanumab is a different situation because you're dealing with a very large population chronic disease. It was a creative regulatory decision. We all know that. The record is clear. One thing, and remember what I said, reasonably likely in the view of a civil servant. So by definition, you have more uncertainty that people have said they're willing to tolerate. Now, we'll see when all the data comes in, but you're also aware that now 2 drugs, very similar, have met the full criteria. One has met the full criteria. One is under review. But the published evidence looks good, so we'll see when the review is finished. And there's a thing about it that I'm personally waiting to see as a cardiologist. You may remember the statins, the ACE inhibitors. These are drugs we use, life-saving drugs in cardiology. Early on in the development of those drugs, we had limited follow-up, like 12 or 18 months, as we have with the Alzheimer's drugs now. The curves start to diverge, and the question is, will they continue to diverge at the same rate, or will they run parallel? Because if you said, gee, I'm going to give a statin to prevent heart attack, if you just said, we'll only look for 18 months, it's beneficial, but the benefit is not that great. If you look at 10 years, that benefit over time, the curves widen, and you're so much better off if you've been on the statin than not. So there's still uncertainty there that we'll have to resolve with follow-up studies. We have learned with all of it that we need to get the follow-up studies done, and as you know, Congress gave us more authority to require those studies. And I'll just throw in for kickers that this work with the NIH. I'll just, I've been on all sides of this, so I feel comfortable saying this. If you let all post-market research depend on the industry that makes the products, you're going to get questions answered that protect the asset, as it's called, the drug or the device. That's what companies do. So they're not going to be asking the public health questions that need to be asked and answered. We need a system that does that, and that's sort of another angle on why we're working on this.
I know we only have a couple minutes left, so I did want to ask another audience question. How do you think recent trends in distrust of science are going to impact the public's view of new and emerging therapies, including advancements in the rare disease and cell and gene therapy space?
That's a really interesting question because let's separate rare diseases or any disease without an effective treatment. I'm not worried about acceptance of those treatments. When people, I had a period of my career where I did a lot of research on end of life, as it was called, with people who had a very short life expectancy. And while it is true that some people say, I'd rather die than have debilitating circumstances, in every society, people want to live longer and have a functional life. And so if you take someone who's got that kind of a disease or whose family has it, they're going to be looking for answers. And I'm less worried about acceptance of the effective treatments than I am about the increasing use of the internet to sell people on cures that actually don't work and have not been through proper testing to find out if they do work. That is a big issue. Now, if you say cell and regenerative therapy for people with chronic non-lethal diseases, that's a very complicated issue because it interfaces with the practice of medicine. It's another case where there are active legal cases now. But I used to run intensive care units, and I worry a lot about people being sold on the idea that a very expensive treatment is going to be effective, and really it's not effective. So the key to all this is generating the evidence to know what's effective and what's not. I guess I keep coming back to that same concept. It's really the basis for an FDA that works.
Just making sure that the evidence is there, and that you've got the folks to review it.
And it's much easier to generate an advertisement or do a podcast than it is to actually do the hard work of doing the clinical trials and getting the evidence. And it takes, this is where the public view is very important because people need to volunteer for those studies, which means you got to have confidence that the system is there for a good reason. And that when they do volunteer, they're not only doing something for themselves, not necessarily because you don't know if you're going to get the effective treatment or not, but you're helping all the other people like you who would benefit from that knowledge.
We've got one last question to ask, but before we do, I just wanted to take a moment and thank the organizers of today's event, Lanman Ligier, and Lori Russo, as well as today's headliner events coordinator, William Pierce, the club events coordinator, Cecily Scott Martin, and club membership director, Kate Helster, and club executive director, Didier Sauji. Thanks to all of you for participating in our discussion. Thank you to all the great questions. And also, Dr. Califf, it is my honor to present you with the National Press Club mug. I think this might be an addition to your collection.
How'd you know? I have a huge, Brooke can tell you, I have an enormous collection of coffee mugs. I don't know why. I just find them interesting.
Well,
this will be right up there as a prize one.
Happy to add one more to it.
Right up there with the Embassy of India, which was a prize one that I just got on my trip to India.
Oh, well, I've got many more questions about it, but as we are out of time, I have to ask the last question. We do like to have a fun question for the last one. And since you are a cardiologist, and since it is Valentine's Day, do you have any advice for all of the lonely hearts out there?
Oh my God. Don't depend on social media. Go out and meet someone, which is the advice I would always give. Go to a place and meet someone if you're a lonely heart. And, you know, I mean, on a somewhat serious note, I do, as we deal with things around the world, it's so obvious we have this epidemic of loneliness right now in our society. And I think we've all got to, maybe the advice should go to the people who are not lonely hearts, that seek out someone and talk to them. And you might be surprised at how happy you can make someone if you go out of your way to be nice and talk with someone. I see Brooke laughing at me because I'm usually thinking about something and I don't even notice, you know, like I can't find the milk in the refrigerator. I don't notice if I walk past someone, but I think that's maybe something that would be good advice.
I love that. That's perfect. Dr. Califf, thank you again so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thanks. You're a great hostess.
Thank you so much. Okay. And with that, we're adjourned.